Okay, so let's look at a couple color options for this, and then we'll do a couple of different styles of illustration. So now if I was going to be coloring this, I always want to make sure that I keep my original line art on its own layer and lock it, because I don't want to fiddle with the line art when I'm in the coloring stage. I'm then going to create a new layer, bring it underneath that line art, and this is the layer I'm going to be working on. So I'm going to call it color. Once I've done that, I'm ready to actually begin coloring. So I might actually take my blob brush tool to fill in some of these shapes, or I can kind of draw them in with the pen tool, or even cut them out using the pathfinder. So there's plenty of videos on how to do that online. I know we watched one last class, so I'm going to do this really quick with the blob brush. And I'm going to select a new color that's maybe a little closer to what I might actually like for the turtle's shell. And I think we'll go with like this peachish coral orange. We can always change it, so there's no worries about that. I'm going to use my brackets to increase my brush size. So the right bracket will make your brush bigger, and the left bracket will make it smaller. And then I'm just going to start kind of coloring in. So this may not be quite as fast as actually just taking a shape and using the pathfinder to cut all your shapes out, but there are some situations in which you might want to do this. For example, if you have a lot of areas that spill out into the workspace, you're not really going to be able to use that pathfinder to cut your shapes, because it's not going to be able to cut a definitive shape. So in this case, this is relatively quick for me, especially because I have a tablet. And as you're working, the new drawings you make should connect with your original blob. If they don't, double click your blob brush and make sure that you have merge only with selection unchecked. And that means every time I draw over, it's going to add it, and it just becomes one larger shape. So let's increase my brush size again, and I'm just going to keep on going until I have the basic shapes of my turtle filled in. And almost done with my shell. Alright, there we go. Now, I'm not going to color the whole turtle because that's going to take way too long, but we will take a look at this shell. Now, the first thing you may notice is I accidentally got a little bit out of my border, and that's easy to fix by just finding our eraser, which I believe is somewhere over here. There we go, by the scissors. And then grabbing our selection and just erasing anything that's sticking out or not where it's supposed to be. From that stage, I'm usually going to come back to my paintbrush, and in this case, I'm going to select a lighter tone, maybe with a little more yellow in it. And I'm just going to start adding some of those details. So if you remember those striations in the shell, this is where I would maybe add those into the artwork. Because these are brushes, brush strokes, not blob brush, they're not going to get connected. So you're going to see that they're still individual shapes, and I'll be able to select those out and kind of play with those later. So I might add a couple more of these just to give you a sense of what I'm doing. And then let me show you just a couple more things you can do. So some other ways you might be able to color in is you could then come back to your blob brush, or even just your regular brush, and make it larger and start sort of shading in areas. So in this case, I'm going to reselect this so I can grab my coral. I'm going to choose a darker color. Let's make sure we're unchecked at that point. Go to a darker color. Increase my brush size, which I can do by, once again, using the bracket tools. And then I might add like dark areas. And you'll see it looks like it's covering up the line artwork, but it drops behind. And that's because we're actually on the layer behind. So here we go. Add some shading like that. And maybe I even want to add some kind of behind these striations. So even though it's in front, we can push it behind by grabbing the object and then using, we can actually right mouse click and send it to back, or we can go to Object and then Arrange, Send to Back. Now I know the keyboard shortcut for this, but I'm not really good at saying it, so I think it's like Command Shift left bracket. And that will drop it behind. Now we just need to drop the coral shape behind that one, and now we can kind of arrange them that way. So you could do your colors, like your shadows and your highlights on different layers, which might be the most efficient way, but I tend to just keep them all together. So we can add shading by hand. We can also draw it in with the pen tool. So we can kind of get these nice little cutout shapes like this, and then color them. Or we can actually use our slice tool to cut up our shapes or to cut areas inside of our artwork and then recolor them. Now, I find this to be the least accurate and most tedious way to do this, especially if you accidentally don't close your shape all the way. This only really works if you're going to use a method like the live paint where each of these cells is its own shape and there's a gap between them. So this is not my favorite way, but it is something you can do for some of the larger shapes. Personally, what I'm normally going to do is come back in and just hand paint in all of my shadows and areas using the brush tool and the blob tool. But if you don't have a tablet and you're not really able to work that way, let's try a slightly different technique. So in this case, I've created some sketches. I've brought them into Illustrator and put them on my template layer. And now I'm just going to create some of these illustrations. So if I do have a tablet, I can come back in with the blob tool and just sort of draw in my simple shapes. So let's say you stole a tablet, but you don't want to do the line art style. You want it to be a little flatter and more like a paper cut. This is a great option. So I'm going to just use my blob tool to create the basic shapes. And then I might come back in with my brush in another color. Let's actually switch to brush real quick. Grab a new color. We'll make it like a dark purple so we can see it. The lowered size of my bracket keys. And then I might even kind of draw in some of that center part of the jellyfish. Add some different tentacles. I don't like those two. Let's do another one. Now these tentacles are a situation in which I might not want to have a highly accurate stroke. I might want it to be a little bit on the smoother side. So I'm actually going to bring that back up. And now they're going to just be a little bit wispier and a little more graphic looking because they're not going to be so bumpy along with my drawing style. There we go. Kind of started that. I'm going to bring this blob to the front so it kind of covers up the origin of those tentacles. And then I'm going to come back in and I'm going to add some line work on top of this. So I'm going to go back to my brush, select a lighter color, maybe a bright yellow, and I'm just going to start drawing in some of the details here. And these are a little bit arbitrary. I don't really have a plan kind of for how these are going to look. But you can see, I can just sort of drop in some nice shapes and colors. And what's really nice about this is I actually really like some of these non-line art outline styles because I think they print a little bit better, especially if you're going to go with fabric. So let's actually, using the brush tool, not the blob tool in this moment, I'm actually just going to draw in this little cluster back here. There's like this strange little protuberance on jellyfish at the bottom, which I guess is kind of maybe where their mouth kind of leads to. Not really sure. There's usually like a cluster of densely packed little tentacles there. So I'm going to draw that. You can see it's different than the blob brush and that it still has a stroke. And then I'm going to send it behind all the way to the back so that now that little shape is filled in. So that's kind of one approach, is sort of going with flat shapes, kind of drawing them over top. And I'm going to show one pattern that kind of made use of this style. The other option, if you only have access to a mouse, is to do this style, but to use your pen tool. And it looks like we're already almost selected. So in this case, if you get some pen tool practice in, it's really helpful to be able to follow your sketches this way. So the better and more clear your sketches or your reference image, the easier this is going to be, because I find working with the pen tool, just freehand with no sketch, to be one of the most difficult things you can do. It's just without knowing where your line is going, it can be really hard to get like a nice looking design. And you can see this isn't perfect, but it's going to be fine. So I'm going to hit escape to break out of it. I'm going to add a stroke to it that I can actually see. So let's make that like a dark color. I'm going to then come back in with my smooth tool, which is always under the shaper tool or the pencil tool. And I'm just going to smooth it out. So if I need perfect curves, this is kind of a good way to achieve them. And you can see I'm able to get a pretty nice curve this way. So I'm just kind of brushing that along until I have the curve that I'm looking for. If I still want to have this nice modulation in line, I can actually add a line style. And you can see if I pump this up a little bit in size, it does create a nice taper, and that actually works pretty well. So I have done this in the past. There's plenty of brushes that you can purchase to do this, but at a minimum, a shape like this works really well. So you still have nice thicks and then some nice little tapering thins. I'm going to come back in and maybe draw the next stage here. I'll just get those to meet up. Draw this little opening to the Nautilus. Then going to hit escape and come back once again and maybe smooth it out just a little bit. So I'm going to make that a little bit heavier, and then I'm going to switch that line style. And you can see that actually works out really well. So this is easy to do with the mouse. You don't have to stress if you don't have access to a tablet. Just pick slightly simpler drawings and you won't really have much of an issue. So at this stage then, I could either leave this line art as it is, or I could fuse this all together to create one solid shape. Now I actually like the line art here, so let's create a solid shape using this one. So in this case, I'm going to go all the way around and make a nice closed shape. And just remember, as you're working with the pen tool, it's going to take the path of least resistance. So point your handles, which is what I have my little cursor on here, in the direction you're trying to go. If you point your handle over here and then try and go back this way, you're going to get like a really odd little curve there. So just be aware that if you just kind of try and guide your shape as you go around by using your handles, you're going to have a much smoother finished object. And there we go. Now, once again, any little minor corrections, easy to fix with our smooth tool. And now we have a nice solid Nautilus shape. So in this case, I'm then going to reverse that so that it's not stroke, it's now filled, and maybe select a new color for it. Bring that to front, and we'll pick like a soft blue. Now I can then go back in and using that same pen tool, draw some really nice details here. So if this is kind of where the center object went, I may want to start here and work my way back, or I may want to create this little curve here. So I'm going to create this little shape here for like the center of the Nautilus. I'm going to make that darker, and then I can just kind of work my way around, creating those little cells on the interior of the shape. And this is where, once again, having access to the sketch itself can be really helpful. So if you kind of find yourself lost, just grab your object. Let's find appearances or transparency, and let's either set it to multiply so you can see behind it, or just set its transparency down a little bit so that you can kind of see your sketch through the object. Now let's make this darker. Grab that. And now I shouldn't have any trouble kind of coming back through and seeing maybe where I'm heading. So let's do that. Create a little cell shape, and then work my way around. And don't be afraid to let these be kind of like playful in the way that you illustrate them. There's no need to get super obsessed with the accuracy, especially if you don't have access to a tablet. It's kind of fun to let them be a little bit more open-ended sometimes. So I am going to do that. Just kind of creating sort of these little angular cells. If my sketch was more clear, like I had really drawn these out nicely, it'd be a little easier to trace them. But for time's sake, I'm not going to get too obsessed with it. I'm just going to try and complete this as fast as possible. But we can start to see the shape coming together now. A couple more, and then we'll be done with the shape. And you can see I just reverted back to this blue, and that's because I accidentally selected this object, so it's always going to try and pull the color from whatever I was selected on last. So one last opening. Let's see if we can get this kind of to define the edge here. Oops. Select it out of my pen. And so you might have seen there, all I had to do is if I accidentally clicked out of my pen, come back to my pen, just click once on the last point of the drawing, and then you should be able to get back to it. And there we go. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to come back in, maybe smooth a couple of these sections, just to give them a little more of a curve. And there you go. So it's a nice kind of playful nautilus right there. I'm going to then bring up the transparency of this object again so that I don't forget about it later and then wonder why it looks funny. So there we have that nautilus. And then if you were doing this one, you could easily pen tool the main shape and then just come back in with the blob brush to draw the cells or the stripes. So in this case, they look like they're supposed to be stripes. So I'll grab dark orange and just start drawing in my stripes. There we go. Okay, so that's a couple different ways that we've shown how we can draw. So using the blob brush and the brush tool, using the brush tool to create our line art and then the blob brush to maybe fill in, using the pen tool to create really nice simple shapes and trace our drawings, and then using the pen tool and the stroke style to make it look like we actually used a tablet and a brush tool. And now the final way to create illustrations is to actually use our shape tool and our pathfinder. So in this case, I'm just going to show a couple simple shapes because you kind of got to use your imagination here. But if I wanted to create a moon, and I know I've shown this before, all I have to do, Option drag, grab it here, highlight both shapes, find our pathfinder panel, and then hit minus front. And you can see, you probably know what most of these do by now, but these will group objects into one, so those will fuse them. This will slice the front out of the back. This will keep the intersection of shapes, and this will keep the outer section of a shape. This one is probably the most useful, and it's divide. And what that'll do is it will slice everything that overlaps, but retain all of the original shapes. So now you have all three objects to play with. And you simply have to either ungroup them or just grab them with your direct selection tool. So using that, if you kind of play around and just make a bunch of different basic things, it's very easy to then later create more complex illustrations. So I'm going to ungroup these, and then I could easily sort of build some really kind of interesting objects here. So the start of a rabbit, or I don't know, it could be anything, but there's a lot of different ways you can sort of cut stuff apart and create some really fun, flat graphic images like this. You can see how it wouldn't be too hard to start with maybe the circle tool here, and then just build some of the little lumpy bits of the jellyfish like this. And then, once those are finished, just fuse them together. And you can see this is a much bolder shape than maybe this sort of wonky one. But it works out really well. And then I can do the same thing with, you know, creating some of these patterns on top. If I don't have access to a mouse, I can create maybe some highlights. Make that a little bit lighter. Some little patterns on top of it. Use those together as well. And there you go. So you can see there's a lot of different ways. Line art with the tablet, blob brush with the tablet, using our pen tool to trace our drawings, using our pen tool to create um, faux hand-drawn line art, and then using our shapes and our pathfinder or line panel to kind of really create some built-up graphic images like this.